Recently, I made over 1 million personal wealth in Manor Lords in under 50 years, and I'll be sharing the most important things that I learned about trade in this video. Check the timestamps to skip to topics that are relevant to you, and let's get into the guide. In the first section, let's talk about what goods to produce based on the region that you're in. My starting region was down here in Eichenhau. I had rich wild animals and rich iron deposit. The wild animals, pretty straightforward. You can get hides, meat, the hides can turn into leather, and the leather can turn into shoes. So you can get 4 different products to sell here with this good. And then iron, I'm not even going to go over the full list because there's so many items you can make with this, but the raw good is iron ore, which can be turned into iron slabs. All of these can be sold, and then eventually when you get enough of an economy, you can turn those into tools. You can get blacksmiths to turn them into weapons or iron parts. All of these can make incredible amounts of money. Some goods are a bit more simplified, like clay deposits. Clay can only turn into raw clay and roof tiles. There's only 2 things you need to worry about there. Rich stone isn't worth anything. Don't ever sell this stuff. It's a waste of time. I didn't have a rich shoal of fish in this particular playthrough, but if you did, you could sell the fish. They're not really worth a whole lot, so I wouldn't focus on that too much. Rich berries can be nice because the berries can be used both for food, or you can sell them for a decent profit. You can turn them into dyes, and then the dyes can then turn into clothing eventually, or cloaks and clothing. A rich salt deposit can be sold directly as salt, or you can turn it in with a butcher. You can turn it into sausages. 1 meat and 1 salt will turn into 2 sausages, which sell for 6 each. So it's actually a pretty good profit if you can find a salt deposit and then produce your own meat. And then the last one that is a rich deposit that is a little bit more complicated to talk about is the soil. You can see here I've got a pretty extensive farm network set up. I've got 3 big fields here, a 4th big field here. This whole farm region produces about 2,500 crops per year, and it produces all kinds of trade goods from linen to gambeson. We also sell bread, and if you don't have enough labor pool, you could sell intermediate products like flour. You could sell any of the grains directly as well, although they're not worth too much. Now that's it for the rich resources. Let's talk about if you don't get a good region. Let's say, take for example, this region up here has only wild berries that are rich. It also has stone, but again, you pretty much ignore that because you can't really sell it and it's not worth much. Other industries you can do revolve a lot around wood or honey making. You see right here, we've got an apiary. This does require 1 development point to put, but you only need 1 to get it going. You need a second one if you want to sell the wax as well. These combined can make a really good economy. You can see we've got quite a few apiaries. They're very simple to use. You can also put livestock in any region. There's no benefit to putting in any specific region. They act the same everywhere. So this can be another good industry. You can get wool from the sheep, and then a weaver's workshop can turn that into yarn to sell, and then the yarn can then be converted over to cloaks or clothes, depending on what your other inputs are. Another one of my favorite ways to make money in a bad region is to use wood products. You can sell firewood in the beginning or planks. Those are okay to get off the ground, but once you get rolling, you really want to eventually go into producing war bows, small shields, large shields. And if you're already producing those in other regions, you want to produce wooden parts as well. And finally, you can produce food in Burgage plot extensions, such as vegetables, apples, and there's also an animal pen that allows you to produce meat or meat and hides if you need that. I wouldn't rely on this too much for making money because it's a lot of extra labor for not a whole lot of reward. Mostly you want to use this food to balance your population, and I would not rely on it to make money as much. So just to recap this section, there are some regions that are better, and we're going to talk about this in the next section, but it doesn't matter what region you're in. You can make really good money no matter where you're at. Some regions will produce more, some a little bit less, but either way, you can make a lot of money and be able to beat the game on the hardest difficulty, even in a bad region. You just need to know which resources you can get away with in a bad region, like livestock, honey, or any of the wood products. Next, let's talk about the best versus the worst regions. And I'll preface this by saying any region can be viable, but some regions are better than others based on how much money you can make per citizen that you have. So let's go over the best regions first. One of my favorites that I like to start with is rich soil and rich clay deposit combined. The rich clay deposit pretty much takes care of your early game economy all the way up into the mid game, maybe even into the late game. Clay and roof tiles are very, very good trade items. The reason they're great in the early game is because you don't need any level 2 burgage plots. All you need is a clay furnace, and then your mine, and then you can directly sell them. Now you do have to pay for the trade route to start selling roof tiles, and we'll go over a good strategy for how to get that done quickly. But just know there's very low barriers to entry here, as opposed to something like, let's say, iron. You got 2 or 3 steps before you can even use the iron, and then you need a level 2 burgage plot with an upgraded extension to be able to turn it into anything. You don't need any of that with clay. And then I really like to have the rich soil, especially for a starting region. It means you don't have to worry about importing ale. You can just do it directly yourself. And that means you can get all of your burgage plots up to level 3. Now, level 3 burgage plots do pay you a tax, and we'll be talking about the math behind the taxes versus the royal tax that you have to pay annually. But if you have rich soil, you don't have to worry about importing it. It removes that cost entirely, and you don't have to worry about packing stations or trading it between different regions. So it's much more efficient to do it in-house, and if it's your starting region, you want to build that up to be a good solid size, this is the way to go. Not only that, but you can produce a huge amount of bread, flour, all these things can be used to grow your population, or if you want to make money, you can just sell it off. And then likewise, you can make linen, gambeson, you can sell the flax directly. You can do a lot of things. It just gives you a lot of options. And these two combined, the clay is great for the early game. The farms are great for the late game when you've had a little bit of time to develop. Because to be able to build a complex farming society like this takes quite a bit of time, actually. You can't just do this in the first 1 or 2 years. It's going to take a bit of time to build up to this limit. And your clay deposit will fund your economy up until you get to that point. Now, the next region, I don't have one on this map, but I will talk about it. I really like to have a rich wild berries and a rich animals deposit. These two are great because both can be sold for a good profit. They both can be used to feed your people, and that pretty much takes care of your early game without any issues. So a wild berry deposit will produce about 880 berries per season. The non-rich deposit produces half of that, I believe. It's about 440. So a lot more food with a rich deposit. And then the wild animals, as we've seen with some of the other regions down here, not only do you have perks that you can add, also on the berries, do not ever get forest management. It doesn't do anything. It's basically a waste of your development point. In terms of animals though, if you have a wild animal deposit, you're definitely going to want to get trapping, advanced skinning, and pelt extraction if you're going to focus on this stuff for your economy. And then as soon as you can, make sure you get the hunting grounds policy. If you get this plus these 3 perks, you're going to have way more food than you can ever consume. You're going to have way more pelts than you can use for leather and shoes. It's just going to be a really, really good and easy start. So again, this is a great combination if you can get rich wild berries and wild animals for an early, and it's even pretty strong in the mid game. It does fall off in the late game and other regions are better, but if that's your starting region, it's perfect because then you can expand into another region that has a better potential for the late game. And then finally, I like to have pretty much any region with iron deposit. It doesn't really matter what the secondary source is. So you can see here I have one with animals. That was a pretty good region. There's another one up here that has animals as well. It's too many animals. I didn't end up using the animals here. I mostly just focused on producing stuff with iron. This specific region, I focused on armor, so helmets, mail armor, and plate armor. And again, you can also sell iron and iron slabs. So really incredible amount of economy. You can do the weapon route, which I did down here. So 2 different regions are producing completely different materials. They don't step on each other's toes in terms of oversupply. If you have 2 regions producing the same goods, you're going to get oversupply issues. Iron deposits are great because not only are they strong for supplying your army if you need to build an army up, they're also great for the economy. Keep in mind, you can immediately start selling products. You can sell your iron ore for 3 per piece, and this stuff flies out very quickly. You can harvest it year round. So it's a really, really good start to your economy if you can get an iron deposit. And then into the mid game, you can produce tools without having to go to level 2 burgage plots. You can sustain an early game economy very well. And then when you move into the late game and you're producing armor, weapons, all kinds of stuff, you don't really need anything else to mix with the iron deposits. You can make a ton of money just with that. Now, if you compare it with something else, I would say rich soil would be really good. Although the problem you run into there is you have too many things to sell and then your trade posts can't keep up with it. So sometimes having too much of a good thing is actually bad because you will flood your trade post and you won't be able to sell anything efficiently. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about some of the worst regions. My personal opinion is any region that has rich stone deposit is bad. Generally, you're going to be at a disadvantage if you have a region that has a stone deposit. If you run out of stone in a region that does not have rich stone, you can simply import it. You don't even have to open a trade route. It's not expensive at all. 10 stone is going to cost you 110. It's dirt cheap. So anytime you get a stone deposit, it's a wasted region, unfortunately. But in my opinion, there's one more that's even worse than that, and I was pretty fortunate not to have it on this map. But if you get a region that has rich wild animals and rich soil, that is a big problem because they conflict. So in order for your wild animals to be efficient, you need to have perks and you need to have the policy. The perks are kind of a problem because farming requires a lot of perks to be very efficient. You're going to want to have heavy plow and bakeries, and you're probably going to want to have irrigation at some point. That's 4 perks right there. If you also have wild animals, you need 3 perks right here to get the most out of your animals. So you're going to be short at least 1 perk. You can do 3 here and you can do 3 here, and you're going to be short. The worst thing of all though, if you have hunting grounds policy enabled, your wild animal deposit will breed twice as fast, but all of your crops will get cut by 50%. So normally this region with all these farms, this produces about between 2 and 2,500 crops per year. If this had the rich wild animals, that would be cut in half. You'd only be getting 1,000 crops, which is a huge amount of labor for a very small amount of materials. So generally, rich wild animals and rich soil is one of the worst regions you can have, assuming you need both of those. So for example, if you already have a region that has rich wild animals, just ignore this. Don't do the policy. You can maybe use this for the early economy and for your early food, but then you're going to want to switch over to doing farmlands and just pretty much ignore your wild animals. You don't need to worry about it too much. But again, it's a wasted potential. If I had to choose, I would rather have the stone deposit, which is weird to say because that was terrible. Ideally, you'd probably want to have anything else. So that's it for the worst and the best regions possible. If you get something like this, especially for a starting region, I would just re-roll the map, start over. It only takes a couple seconds, but hopefully that helps. Let's move on to the next section. In the next section, we'll talk about trade posts. Let's start off with how they work. There's 2 ways that a trade post works, passive and active. We're going to focus in the beginning on passive. So if you scroll out to the map and you hold tab, you're going to see these little icons floating around. And if you hover your mouse, it calls them traveling merchant. So these guys travel the map on their own. They will follow what's called the King's Road, and they will go to any trade post that is on the King's Road, and they will trade there. Just be aware, not every traveling merchant will buy or sell every single type of item. They have specific goods in their inventory. If they don't have what you're looking for or what you're trying to sell, you'll have to wait for the next one. So it's not a very fast way of making money, but it is really good in the early game when you have a lot more time than you have money to pay for more labor or to open your own personal trade routes. So it can be really good in the early game when you're just trying to get established. And you'll see right here, we don't have an established trade route. So this can only be done passively. However, certain items cannot be traded passively. You'll notice right here, these say NA. These are major trades. If you see anything labeled as minor, this can be traded passively without a trade route. Anything major, they will not actually purchase. So even if this thing has rift tiles, if you don't actually buy the trade route, they won't come by and pick them up, even if that person would normally do that. So you can look through here. There's a lot of minor trades, and then there's a couple major trades at the bottom. Until you get to the manufactured goods, the commodities, these are all major trades. And then the military, these are all major trades as well. So these first 4 tabs have a decent amount of stuff that can be traded passively. But again, you have to be on the King's Road, and let's talk about that for a quick second. If you're not sure what a King's Road is, it's the roads that are placed at the beginning of the map, and they are the major roads. So major roads aren't necessarily King's Roads. You'll know if it's a King's Road by clicking on your road icon and then hold Alt and then hover your mouse over the King's Road, and it'll say you cannot delete it. So King's Road cannot be removed. So if you're ever not sure, just test it before you build your trade post. Make sure that you check it first, because sometimes there are roads that the AI puts that you didn't put, but it's not technically the King's Road. You'll be sitting there waiting forever. Yeah, here's a good example. So here's the King's Road. This is in the region of Zweiau. So I haven't built anything here because we don't control the region. We can test it by going to the roads, hold Alt, and you can see right here, this is all King's Road. All King's Road. If I check this one right here, we definitely didn't build this. And if I hold Alt, I can actually delete this. So I'm not going to delete it, but I could, which means if you put a trade post on here, even though the AI put this for us, you cannot actually use it. So if you put a trade post here, it's just going to sit idle. It's not going to work. So make sure you do that. Now, the second way to do passive trading is to actually purchase a trade route. You'll notice here, this is one that has not been purchased. And as soon as you purchase it, you get this sliding caravan. It does cost a pretty good chunk of money to open trade routes, but they will send people directly to that region to trade, and they will buy a pretty big quantity. I believe they usually trade 50 at a time, or up to 50 depending on how much you're looking to trade. So 3 things are really good about this. Number 1, the volume is really high. Number 2, you don't have to be on the King's Road. And number 3, it's passive. You don't need to have anybody working here other than to just stock the goods. And then they will come by and buy those on their own. Now be aware, when you open a trade route, they will send a merchant to go to 1 trade post. They will not go to 2. So if we look at this region, when you have more than 1 trade post, you're going to see this happen. You can have at most 50 of an item between all of the trade posts in a region for a specific item. So that means in this region, I can only have 50 shoes total in any combination of the trade posts. So for example, I can have 25 shoes in this one, and I can have 25 shoes here. I can't have 50 and 50. It doesn't work that way. It caps you at 50 total. So that can be a problem, because if your trade caravan's coming through and they go to this, they're going to buy all 26 shoes, and then they're going to go back to the edge of the map, and that's it. They will never touch the 13 that are over here. So if you have multiple trade posts, you're actually lessening the effectiveness of the caravans that you're sending here that you paid for. So that can be a problem that can only be overcome through sheer labor, which we'll talk about in the next section. But just be aware, in the early and mid game, try to have only 1 trade post so that all of the caravans you purchase will go through that trade post, and hopefully your people will stock them up all the way up to 50 total. So when the caravan hits, you're going to sell all 50 at once, and then you can start the cycle again, and you'll be maximizing your profits. Now, the next section is going to be active trading. This is where you are actually sending people to the edge of the map with goods in hand to sell manually. That means you can have as many trade posts as you want, and they will actually go to the edge of the map with those goods and sell them. You can upgrade that by having them ride a horse. You can see here I have 2 horses assigned as livestock, and that increases the amount of weight that they carry, and I believe it increases the speed, although it's not that much faster. But yeah, it's definitely a huge upgrade to have them have a horse, because they do have a cart. It's a horse with a cart, and they have a huge amount of inventory that they can carry. So as you get into the late game, you'll notice here my passive trading was not enough to keep up with the supply that I was having. I needed to get rid of it faster. So what I did is I loaded these trading posts up. I've got multiple horses in here. I've got 4 horses total. I've even got some extra families helping to stock these as fast as they can. And you'll notice the actual income from this region is quite high. If we go to our trade tab and we look at the last 365 days, it's over 10,000 for one region. That's really, really good. There's no way you'd be able to do this amount of volume if you were just relying on the traders that came in passively. Again, if you want to sell more, you could add more trade posts. The problem comes up where they can only carry 1 type of good at a time. They will not fill up their cart completely. They will just carry as much as they can of 1 item. So for example, here they would take 4 polearms, go to the edge of the map, sell it, come back. Then they would take 4 leather, go to the edge of the map and sell it. So you can see if you have, let's say you had 10 trade posts and they each had 1 item in each, you would actually have the same efficiency if you had all 10 items in 1 trade post with just 1 horse. So there is a law of diminishing returns when you have more trade posts. So you don't want to build 10 or 20 of these things, because you're just going to split up all of your inventory among all these. And until Greg fixes the game where you can actually limit what items go in specific trade posts, you're going to want to limit your trade posts to maybe 2, sometimes 3. I probably wouldn't go over 3. Maybe you can test it and see if it helps. But in my experience, going over that, you're just going to have a ton of small stacks of specific items, and it doesn't work very well. So 2 to 3 posts, fully staffed. Make sure you get horses. That's the best way to go, and you can make a ton of money. Now that brings up the next part of this section. How many goods should you sell in a region? Now this is a bad example. Don't do this most of the time. This was a lot of trial and error to get to this, and it actually worked out fairly well. But in my experience, anytime you go over 3 or 4 items, you're going to run into some pretty serious trouble. You see, this region is selling 5 different items, but the volume is much lower. It's only 4,000. Even though the volume is actually quite high, but the overall volume is low, because there's some items that are selling in high volume. See this right here, the meat is selling 468 units. The leather is selling 404 units. This is about a little over 1,000 units worth of goods. And if we come back here, if we add up all these, it's a little more than 1,000, but it's not. Yeah, it's about 1,400, because this one's actually pretty high. Is about 500 there. But if we look at some of these other regions that weren't selling quite as much volume, they do get stuck because they get flooded with a lot of items. So generally what you want to do is for your region, pick 3 to maybe 4 items that you're just going to mass produce and try and get as much of the volume of that as you can, and then blast them out with 1 to 2 trade posts if you can survive. I find the most efficient is 2 trade posts, but sometimes you can get a good setup where 1 is actually doing the same work. Kind of trial and error there. It's hard to say do this, do that. You kind of have to trial and error it, but just know that this is kind of the range. Now, one rule of thumb you can go by is the higher the volume of an item you're selling, the less types of items you can add. So for example, this region is selling 900, almost 900 of 2 different items. That basically takes up all the volume capacity that those trade posts can handle. So you don't want to do too many more types of goods on here. So again, 5, I kept it at 5. I probably should have kept it at 4 and it would have been just as efficient. Over here, I was selling a lot more different types of items because most of them I was selling between 1 to 200 of each. So 200 weapons, 270 weapons, 170 leather, 300 shoes, not high volume compared to some of the other items. So the lower volume you have, the higher different types of goods that you can sell. One important thing to keep in mind is where you place your trade post can be very important. Now, I didn't do a very good job in this playthrough of doing it, but I'll show you the most optimal way of placing them. In the early game, they just need to be on the King's Road if you're going to be using the passive trading. So just place them as close to your resources to minimize the trip to stock the trade post, but it does have to be on the King's Road. And one tip with that, I've run into this before, and it's really aggravating. If you have a road that's very curvy, take for example this curvy. If you have a road that's really curvy, sometimes you can put your trade post and it looks like it's on the road, but it actually, because of the curve, that little circle is actually not touching the road. So it's technically not on the King's Road as far as what the game thinks. So you have to be very careful if you're doing it on a curve like this. So I generally avoid putting them on curves like this. You can see the circle's actually not touching technically. It's not on the road. So this one the trader will not service this even though it's inches away from it. So try and put it on a straightaway. If you put it on the other side of the curve, it's for sure going to be touching. So you'll be good there. Once you get to the mid and late game, you're going to want to organize your trade goods a lot more effectively. Now, the most efficient way to do this is to have a combination of storehouse and granary depending on what kind of items you're selling, and have it as close to your trade post as possible. Now, these storehouses and granaries are not meant to be used for normal use. This is only to stock the final trade goods that you're selling at your trade post. Let's say we want to sell clay tiles. You can see we've got our mining pits up here, clay furnace, and a storehouse here just to collect all those goods when they're done. Now, normally your trade post would have to travel all the way up here to grab the clay tiles and then all the way back to restock it. That's very inefficient for the people that have to work here. So generally what you're going to want to do is have a storehouse with at least one person, and you want to go to the advanced tab and turn everything off. Turn everything off to begin with, and then go back in and figure out what it is that you're going to be trading there. So in this case, we're going to be doing roof tiles, and let's say we wanted to do clay as well. So you'd enable clay. Now this person's going to go out and grab both of those, bring it back here. Now your trade post only has to go half a block, grab it, and then right back here. So you won't have to have too many people in the trade post. You'd probably want to cap this out at 2 workers with 2 livestock, with 2 horses in here, and then it's very, very efficient. Now, again, in this example, this isn't a very far distance to travel, so it's not a great example, but let's say if they were halfway across the region, this would be really the only feasible way you'd be able to make this trade setup work, because you'd have to go get the final product and then bring it all the way back here. Same thing goes for the granary. If you were selling ale or bread or whatever else it is that you want to sell, you're going to want to have somebody in here. You're going to want to limit what goes in here to make sure your guys aren't going out and just collecting random stuff. So we would collect ale and bread, throw a worker in there. And if you've got a weird setup where maybe you've got multiple areas where they can get bread from, you could always designate a specific area. Let's say you have bread production over here. You could have all the bread that you want to sell come over here, and all the bread you want your people to eat to come over here. And you could just separate these by limiting the work area. So there's a lot of ways you can do it. But again, the most important thing is to make sure in the late game, especially when you're having 2 or 3 trade posts working, you're going to want to limit the amount of labor they have to do to get these restocked. And it's better for the labor to fall on a storehouse worker than it is to fall on a trading post worker. These guys are much more efficient at collecting goods. Usually have it set up like this and have all your trade posts in one central location so they can all feed off of these. And then let's talk about what happens if you start to oversupply your markets. So you can see right here, I have several regions that are selling meat and the price has gone down quite a bit. It's actually right now in this playthrough where I have the save file, it's actually only one green arrow. It's only oversupplied. It's not critically oversupplied. But for most of my playthrough, this was all critically oversupplied and they were only paying 1 gold per meat. I have some other items like the hides. I mentioned before, one region is enough to supply hides to get it to oversupply, and I have 3 regions producing hides. So you can see the oversupply is really easy to hit. So what ends up happening is your price is going to plummet and you're doing the same amount of labor to produce those goods and sell them, but you're getting half or sometimes less than half of the money that you should be getting. So generally make sure that you're not oversupplying markets unless it's a low tier item. Some items have a really low price to begin with. One good example of that is planks. So planks are 2. If you oversupply, it goes to 1. Getting 1 instead of 2 is a pretty big difference, but still, it's not that big of a difference. If you were to sell something like firewood, it only sells for 1, or clay, it only sells for 1. You can spam these items in any region and it doesn't matter if it's oversupplied because it'll never go below 1. So again, most items you don't want to oversupply, especially the bigger ticket items. You don't want to oversupply stuff that's costing you, that you can sell for 8 or 6 or 7. Any of these items, you don't want to oversupply. You got to be very careful with that. But some of the raw materials, it's not as big of a deal because those don't have a whole lot of labor going into them to produce them. But if you can avoid it, it's a best practice to avoid critical oversupply. So again, I'm not going to tell you specific numbers that you can trade in volume that will cause an oversupply because it's different for each item from what I can tell. And what I would recommend is not to sell the same item in more than one region if you can help it. The reason I was doing meat and some of these other items is because I have too much of it and I have no way of getting rid of it, and it was clogging up my warehouses, my storehouses. So in that case, it was more of an inventory control issue than a making money issue. So that's the only reason I was doing that with that and the meat. But outside of that, don't oversupply if you can help it. One way that you can avoid oversupplying, and I touched on this in another section already, we can take wild animals as an example. You can sell all 3 stages of this product. You can sell the hides for 4 gold each unless it's oversupplied, and then obviously that price is going to dump. You can sell the leather for 6 unless you're oversupplied, which you can see I'm doing a bad job here. I got 3. I have a lot of stuff oversupplied, but we'll talk about that later. You could sell hides, leather, and then you can eventually sell shoes. You can sell all 3 stages. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if I converted all those hides and leather into shoes and then only sold the shoes? Yes, you would make more money, sort of, but once you start to oversupply, your price is going to go down and you have a lot of labor that goes into that. So in my opinion, it's actually better if you're oversupplying on the top level. So for example, you're oversupplying on shoes, it's better to back off on your shoe production and then go down a level and start selling the next product. Sell as much leather as you can. Then once that starts to oversupply, you start slowing this down by putting production caps, which we'll go over production cap soon. You put a production cap in so you don't make too much, and then you're going to want to go up to the next level up, which is the hides. Then you start selling that. Now you're selling at 3 different tiers and they're all hopefully not oversupplied. You're making the maximum amount of money with the minimum amount of labor. Because remember, every time you go from a hide to a leather, it takes a worker to be able to do that. It also takes a worker to go from leather to shoes, and that worker has to be in a workshop that you can't use anywhere else. That they're stuck as a cobbler. They can't do any other job. Generally, you want to be careful with your production and not overproduce, especially on these top level items. These ones are hard to undo. Something to think about there. Now, the next section, we're going to talk about the progression of your trade routes and your trade setup in Empire. Starting with the beginning, how do you get your first trade route purchased? Because sometimes in the very beginning, you need to buy some extra oxen. Maybe you buy burgage plot extensions and you don't have any money to open your first trade route. And it can be kind of tricky figuring out how to do that. Generally, what I recommend doing is starting a trade route, a trade post, fairly early on, usually in your first maybe 1 or 2 years. Make sure it's on the King's Road so you can get some passive income. And you're going to want to sell whatever you have available. My 2 go-to items, no matter what region you're in, planks are number 1 because they are worth 2 gold each and they're very easy to get. Not a whole lot of labor involved. And the second one is going to be firewood. Firewood is very quickly harvested, so it may not seem like a lot. You only get 1 per, but keep in mind, these guys produce a lot. Again, you only need enough to buy your first trade route, and then you can turn these off. Now, if you're specifically in certain regions, let's say you're in a region that has wild animals, I would 100% focus on selling hides, because these are worth a lot in the early game. So hides are good for that. If you have a region that has ore, all you need is one deep mine and just sell a couple iron ore. They're worth 3 each, so you can get your first trade route after maybe not even half a month of mining stuff. Same thing for clay. You can sell the clay, although these only sell for 1 each, so not the best, but it's probably better selling these than selling firewood. I would say firewood is my least favorite to sell, but it is a good option if you got nothing else. I would recommend not selling berries for your first trade route. Save that for your food because you never want to run out of food. And in case you're still very new, I'll show you how that works. Let's say you have a few planks piled up right here. You're going to come to your trade post, go to planks, and you're going to export. And you want to set yourself a desired surplus. This means you will not sell anything less than this amount. So for example, if we have 20 planks in stock and you want to keep at least 10 so that you can upgrade some buildings, then you put this up to 10. You will sell, of the 20, you'll sell 10, and then you won't touch 10. So you'll see in your trade post, they'll go gather 10, they'll put it in here, and then they'll leave the other 10 in the storage. And once you have your first trade route established, then we move on to the next phase. So let's take this region for example. If I have clay deposit, it's very easy to get your clay industry up and running. You just need a deep mine and a clay furnace. You don't need level 2 burgage plots at all. You just need to have enough money to start the first trade route. Focus on getting enough people in the mine to make sure that you can make enough clay tiles or roof tiles so that you can sell a full load every time that trader that you bought comes by. It's going to be different depending on where you are on the map and where that trader comes from. But all you have to do is just keep an eye on it. Every couple months, take a look at your stock of roof tiles. If you notice your roof tiles are going up to, 2, 3, 400, then you know that the trade route is not keeping up with the amount that you're producing. So you're good there. If you're constantly at 0 roof tiles because the guy's buying them out, that's good, but that means you need to increase your production as soon as you can. So put more people on the deep mine, put a couple more people in the clay furnace or build a second clay furnace, and then make sure that you're maxing out that first trade good before you start adding on new trade goods. It's really easy to get sidetracked and forget to do things to be efficient, or it's also really easy to flood the market with 5 trade goods when you only have 10 of each. Rather than having 50 of one, I would much rather have 50 of one than 10 of 4 different ones. It's just so much easier to deal with. Now, on the flip side, you also, as I mentioned before, you don't want to flood the market and oversupply. So be aware of that. If you start to oversupply, then what you're going to want to do is come in here to your advanced, and you can probably decrease your production limit. So put it down to maybe like 60 or below. Even you could even go below 50. Maybe set it to 40. Then your trade post will only have access to say 40 at a time. That may get your price to drop on this area. Your roof tiles, maybe it'll go back up to normal price. Then you know you're in the clear. Now the next step is to add more than one trade good and maximizing those as well. In this region, I have clay and I have rich soil. Now, with the rich soil, I was trying to sell all kinds of items. I was selling gambeson. I went flax to linen to gambeson. And you can see I have that production right here. Linen and gambeson, and I have the tailor's workshop right there. I was also selling bread. So that's wheat from the field, flour from the mill. And then I had a bakery, which turned that into bread. So that was all being sold. I maximized that. And then finally, you have to be careful with this one if you have a region that's relying on it. But your ale, you can produce ale to sell that, barley to malt to ale. And you can see I've got all those right here. So I have my malt houses, I've got the large granary where all the barley comes in, and then the tavern right next to it, fully supplying tons of ale for these people. Now, as I mentioned, this region produces about 2,500 crops per year. It's about 800 of each crop type. So 800 barley turns into 1,600 malt and 1,600 ale. So 1,600 ale per year, that's a lot of ale. That's definitely maximizing the area. Same thing with the linen and same thing with the bread. It's a lot of bread and linen. So this region was maximized one at a time. Well, technically the farm goods were done all at the same time because the fields produce at the same rate for each good type. So not much you can do about that. But yeah, I focused on clay first, and then I focused heavily on the farms to get them up and running. And then this region was producing ale for other regions. That's why I wasn't selling it as much. It may look like this region is not making that much. It's only making 3,900, but it is producing enough ale for this region to survive without having to import barley. If you check the imports here, I was spending over 4,000 a month on barley imports. So it may look like this one's only producing 3,900, but keep in mind, if you don't spend money at another region, that means you're actually making that as a profit in this region. So technically, this region was making an extra 4 grand on top of that. So this was making about 8,000 in total, technically, because I didn't have to spend it in another region, right? A penny saved is a penny earned, as they say. And then finally, let's talk about setting up trade in multiple different regions. There's not a whole lot to discuss here other than don't set up the same type of goods in multiple regions. What I mean by that is don't sell shoes in 3 different regions, don't sell hides in 3 different regions, unless you have to, as I mentioned before, to clear your inventory. But if it's strictly profit speaking, you want to have one region focus and specialize on a good and not have 5 different regions doing that good as well. So for example, this area has ore and is focusing primarily on weapons. I have another ore region up here that is primarily focusing on armors. So you can see right here, we're producing helmets, mail armor, and plate armor. So I'm making sure not to double up on a good, and I spread it out pretty evenly. Now, one region that is kind of tough to produce in 2 regions is clay deposit, because one region can easily oversupply a market, let alone having 2. So if you get something like this, it's unfortunate. Maybe leave one region alone and just produce it only in one of the regions. Save your labor for the other region. They can produce something else, like they can produce wood products or whatnot, and you can make more money that way. Let's talk about a little bit more of an advanced concept. This is the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost means if you spend something in one area, it means you're not spending it in another area. A good example of this is your labor. So if I put somebody in the deep mine, that means I am not able to put them in a charcoal kiln. I'm not able to put them in a large storehouse. I'm not able to put them in some other type of industry. So there's an opportunity cost there by putting them somewhere as opposed to somewhere else. Now that might sound obvious, but it'll make a little bit more sense in just a minute. If I put somebody in here in the deep mine to mine ore, I can produce enough ore and that ore will sell for 3 gold each. If I have in that same region, let's say I have a deep mine that's producing clay, the clay only sells for 1 gold each. And let's say the clay and the iron ore produce at the same rate, which they do. Would it be better to put somebody in an iron pit or a clay pit? And that is what I'm talking about when I say opportunity cost. If you put somebody in the iron pit, your opportunity cost is 2 gold higher than if you put it in a clay pit, if you're just selling the base goods, right? Because here they're producing something that's only worth 1. And for the same unit of time to produce that good, you could have made 1 iron ore and sold it for 3 instead of 1. So there's an opportunity cost there. Now, the opportunity cost gets more complex when you add a supply chain. To be able to turn this iron ore into something else, you have to turn it into an iron slab, and then the iron slab can turn into a tool or a weapon. It has to go to 3 different locations, right? It goes from here to here, that's 1 trip. From the bloomery to the smithy, that's 2 trips. Or the bloomery to the blacksmith, that's 2 trips. And on top of that, if you have some inefficiencies, like let's say you go from a deep mine to a warehouse first, and then the warehouse to a bloomery, and then the bloomery back to a warehouse, and then the warehouse to a smithy or something else. Now you're adding more trips in between. That is adding to your opportunity cost because you need labor to be able to do all that, but you're not increasing the sale price of what you're doing. Let's look at the opportunity cost again of your deep mine for iron versus the clay pit. Let's say we want to sell tools, and to be able to do that, I have to go deep mine, bloomery, smithy, and the tools are worth 6 each. So it's 3 steps, sells for 6. The clay pit is 2 steps. You go mining pit, clay furnace, and you're done. You have a roof tile, and that sells for 8. So the opportunity cost of producing iron versus producing clay is actually quite a bit more. You might think it's only 2 because the tools sell for 6 and the roof tiles sell for 8. That's a difference of 2, but it's actually more than that because you have to consider the labor that you used, right? You have 1 person working here to produce the iron ore. You have 1 person turning iron into iron slab. And then you need another person to produce an iron slab into a tool. That's 3 people. Over here, you only need 2 people to produce 1 roof tile. So not only do you make more money with the roof tile, but you need 1 less person to be able to complete the process. Every time you have a person in your town, you have to feed them, you have to build them a house, to give them firewood. If they're families that are higher level burgage plots, you also need to provide more food types. You need to provide more clothing types. There's a lot of things that are involved. So again, it's not just the sale price, it's how many people that are involved in it and what resources need to go into supporting their families to be able to produce those. So if I were starting in a region, let's say that had clay deposit and an iron deposit, in the very beginning, your opportunity cost for working on iron means that you would make less money and produce less goods because you need more labor to produce the same amount of stuff. So your opportunity cost, you're better off spending that labor on clay to produce tiles and then going that route. Now, obviously you get to a point where you maximize this out. Now, if you keep going, your opportunity cost goes down because you are actually getting less, right? You oversaturate the market and the price that you're getting for your clay tiles, your roof tiles goes down. So in that case, that's when you need to switch over to a new industry. So when I say opportunity cost, that's what I mean. When you're looking at your regions and saying, what should I produce first? What should I sell first? You want to look at your opportunity cost of how much do I pay that person to work? How many people do I need to get that good? And how much work, basically look at the whole package. Wild animals is a great example. You can sell all the resources leading up to shoes. It does require 3 touches to get to shoes, but you could sell the hides first, you could sell the leather, and then eventually you could sell the shoes. And if you oversupply, you could just back it off and sell the intermediate as well. It's a very good product to sell in the early game. And then you get to something like farming. Farming is probably the most complex of all of them, other than maybe iron. There's an argument to be made there. But I personally think that farming is the worst in terms of opportunity cost because there's so much involved. It takes a lot of your time personally to set these up and to make sure everything's balanced. It takes a huge amount of labor to pull this off. You need a lot of people in your farmhouse. You need a lot of people to be able to pull those resources into a central region, process them like at your windmill, and then you need somebody else to do the bakery. There's a lot of people that are involved in making a farmhouse profitable, which is kind of why you see this region not producing nearly as much profit as, say, a region like this with less people. You can still make good money with this, but just be aware, probably want to do other things first before you do the more complex ones. As a rule of thumb, clay is really good for early game. Wild animals, really good for early game. Wood products can be good for, say, the mid game because they can be done anywhere. And when I say wood products, I mean like shields, like right here, shields, war bows, stuff like that. And then as you move into the late game and you run out of stuff to sell, you probably want to maximize your iron deposits because these can make a tremendous amount of money. They just take a lot of labor to do so. So that's what I mean by opportunity cost. Now, there is another way to make money that doesn't involve selling anything, and that is through taxes. There's 2 types of taxes in this game. There's taxes that you have to pay to your king, and there's taxes that you collect from your people. Not to be confused with the tax that you levy to turn your regional wealth, this one right here, land tax. I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about money you make from your people when you upgrade their burgage plots. And then the king's tax is what you pay at the end of the year. So those are the 2 taxes I'm talking about. We'll talk about this land tax in the next section. So we're strictly talking about making money from your people just by them being alive and living in your towns. So when you upgrade a burgage plot to level 2, they generate 1 regional wealth per family per month. When they go from level 2 to level 3, they generate 2 regional wealth per family per month. And I'm going to put up on the screen here all the stats for the taxes based on your difficulty setting and also comparing that versus what your regional wealth is based on the burgage plot levels that you have. So a level 2 plot with 1 family will produce 1 per month, which is 12 regional wealth per year. A level 3 plot will produce 2 regional wealth per family per month, which turns into 24 regional wealth per year. Your taxes are calculated on an annual basis. If you're on normal difficulty, it starts at 5 years. It goes up at 10 years and it maxes out at 15 years. So from 0 to 5 years, you don't pay any tax. From 5 to 10, you pay 1 regional wealth per person per year. So 1 family is actually technically 3. From 10 to 15, it is 2 regional wealth per person or 6 per family. And then from 15 on onward, it's 3 per person or 9 per family. If you're playing on hard difficulty, all that is doubled. For the first level, you're paying 6. The second level, you're paying 12. And the third, you're paying 18 per family. It's very expensive to have people if you're playing on the hardest difficulty, where it doubles the tax. Now, if you have all level 1 plots, and you are in year 15, you're obviously going to be losing money for every family that you have. If you're on normal difficulty, you can actually still pull a profit with each family if everybody is upgraded to level 2 plot, because you make 12 per year, but you're spending 9 per year in the tax. So you technically net 3 regional wealth per year. It's not a lot, but it's something. If they're all level 3 plots, now you're netting 15 because you make 24 from the tax and you pay 9 to your king. So you net out 15. If you're on the hardest difficulty, the only way you ever make a little bit of profit without losing money, again, this is not including your trade. If you're making money through trade, you can offset the tax. But I'm just saying, if you want to make money on your people without anything else, on the hardest difficulty, every plot level has to be level 3, which means you're going to be supplying a lot of ale, a lot of clothing, and a lot of different types of foods to everybody on the map. So you'll be paying 18 per family, and you'll be making 24 per month, so you make 6 per family. If you're considering how many level 1s, level 2s, and level 3 plots you're going to want to have, the biggest determining factor here is how easy is it for you to obtain ale in that region. I'll give you an example I can have. This region was my starting region, and I don't have rich soil. So I had to import barley, and it was extremely expensive. To be able to supply less than 300 people in this town, I was having to spend over 4,000 per year, which is a huge amount. I mean, some of these regions that are producing decent amount of goods are not even making that. They're making about 3,800 per year. So it would have been a net loss in those regions, just on the ale alone. So you have to have some kind of cost benefit analysis to see if it makes sense. And that's why I was saying, if you have a region where you have rich soil, you don't have to worry about that. You can upgrade everybody to level 3, and you should upgrade to everybody to level 3, because you're going to get the most utility out of all your people there. So in general, what I like to do for regions that don't have easy access to barley or ale, try not to import. You can still have a certain amount of level 2s and level 3 burgage plots without pissing off everybody in your town. You can see here, this region doesn't have any ale, and we are sitting at about a 56% approval rating. Just by ignoring the people that are complaining, you will not lose people unless you go below 25% approval. So if we wanted to have above, say, a 75%, we would have to pay money. We don't get any benefit from that other than having a faster immigration rate. If your town is at the size that you want it to be, just make sure you don't go below 25%, but make sure you don't spend money to get it above 20, too much higher above 25%, because there's no benefit to it. So I would generally try and run a very lean region. So for example, this region is producing about 4,000 in revenue per year, and it has 110 people, and we multiply that by 6, that's 660. On the hardest difficulty setting, we'd be paying 1,980 in tax, but we would be generating 4,100. So we'd still be making a profit here, even though we don't have a bunch of people at level 3, right? So obviously the math is different when you have a bigger settlement. This one is 287 people. This region actually costs 5166 to maintain. Now this region is making a pretty good profit. It's making over 10k. So we would still be netting out 5k per year here. So still worth it. And that does not include the amount of money that we're making from the family. So we would have to add that back in. So if we're paying 5166, we would be making 2,200 in tax from our tier 3 burgage plots. So we wouldn't actually be paying 5,100. We would actually be paying about 3,000, roughly, a little less than 3,000. So it does help even out if you have level 3 burgage plots and you can afford the ale for it. But again, if your motivation for getting level 3 burgage plots is to make tax money, you have to keep in mind how much that's going to cost you. So if we're making 2,200 in tax, but it's costing us 4,400 in ale, you're going to actually lose 2,200 in Treasury just to supply people with ale and keep them happy. So you would be better off not having a bunch of burgage plots at level 3 and just having them lower tier and not having to buy the ale or import it. Now, obviously, if you have a region that's producing more than it needs, you can send it there. And that's what I was mentioning in the other section. This region only produces 3,900 in revenue, but it actually produces about 4,400 more because some of that expense is not being incurred here, which means it's technically should be attributed back to here as a profit. To sum this section up, I know this one's a little bit more in the weeds, but in general, don't rely on your people paying tax to make money, especially on the harder difficulties. You're just going to end up losing more money than you're making for the most part, unless you have a region that can produce ale or can easily get ale for free. And for the final section, I had mentioned it before, we're going to talk about taxes. And by that, I mean land tax. This basically is a number that converts your regional wealth into your personal treasury at the expense of approval loss. So whatever number you put in here, it takes a percentage of this number. So let's just use easy math. Let's say 10%. So 10% of 12,000 is going to be about 1,200. I would turn 1,200 from here. It would get subtracted from this balance and it would be moved over here to my treasury. This would increase by 1,200. And then we would get an approval loss of minus 17. And you would see that apply here. You can see taxation. In this case, I had it at minus 6. So we had our tax at a lot more reasonable rate. But there's a lot more nuance here that you have to keep in mind. It says minus 6, but it's actually not minus 6. It's more than that, especially if you do it for, say, a year or 2 years straight, because your previous month actually adds up. So every time you have an approval loss in this month, it carries over and sticks with you for your previous months for, I think it's 9 months before it starts to drop off. I could be wrong on that. Maybe it's 12 months, but anytime you get a negative on this month, a certain percentage of that gets carried over into previous months. So a minus 6 can actually turn into, say, a minus 40 if you have it turned on long enough. So let's say you're getting minus 6 every month. It actually builds up to be a very large number after 6 or 7 months. And then you need to wait another 6 or 7 months for that to clear. So you have to be careful not to tax too high and too often. Now, if you do, let's say you do a big chunk, let's say you do like a 20% and you do it all in 1 month, that can be okay if you have enough room here, because that'll drop off eventually. And then you just go back to, say, 0 after that. You get your big hit of money turned into your treasury, and then you turn it off. That can be a way to do it. I personally prefer to do a nice, small, gradual gain, say somewhere between 1 and 4 to 5%. And that's something that your approval rating can absorb. And the approval rating that you have is going to depend on what you have in your town. So for example, this place was struggling with lack of entertainment a little bit. I had ale run out and I had to import it, but there was a delay from when I caught it to when the ale actually started being produced. If we go to another town where they have ale permanently, say Eichenau, there's almost nothing that they're unhappy about. The biggest thing is taxation. And you can see it actually piled up to minus 8 for this month and a minus 21 for previous months. So it's not minus 8. It's actually bigger than that. It's actually minus 29 because you have to add those two numbers. I try not to tax my people too much, and I let my regional wealth build up to a pretty comfortable amount where every month I'm getting, even with a 1 or 2% tax, I'm still getting, 200, 300 a month from each region. And that adds up over time very, very quickly. Now, in this case, I had some regions that had regional wealth built up of, I think this one, the starting region had about 350,000 before I started taxing them. Some of these other regions had 150 to 200,000 before I started taxing them. In a normal playthrough where you're actually fighting people, you generally want to get up to a couple thousand, maybe 4,000 or 5,000, and then start taxing at 1 or 2%. If you have the approval rating to spare, you can go higher than that, but I would caution that and just keep in mind that you have your this month and you have your previous month taxation. You have to add those two up and make sure you account for that. But there aren't too many things that you need your personal treasury for. The biggest one is going to be your retinue. Once you get your retinue set, and if you're not hiring a bunch of mercenaries, you don't really need that much in your personal treasury anyway. You need a little bit to start a new region. You need 750 if you want to have a good start, which is not that much. It's a couple months savings. Let me know in the comments if I missed any topics or if anything was unclear. It's been a few months since I produced a guide and I'm still getting back into my workflow, so I'm sure there's a lot of improvements to be made here. Let me know. If you're interested in watching the full challenge run, you can click the video on screen now. A huge shout out to the YouTube members and Patreon supporters for supporting our channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.